Picture this headline flashing across your phone on a random Tuesday morning. Xi Jinping set to land in Washington as farmers. Wait, engineers wait, and the world's two biggest economies play their last card before September 24th. It sounds like something ripped from a thriller, but it is exactly the situation unfolding right now between the United States and China. And it touches almost every part of daily American life without most people ever noticing the connection. The story does not start in Washington. It starts on a farm in Nebraska with a woman named Sarah, who has grown soybeans on the same land her grandfather worked for over 60 years. For most of her career, China was her best customer, buying more American soybeans than any other country on earth, filling the holds of massive cargo ships bound for Shanghai and Qingdao. Then, in 2025, everything stopped. During the height of the tariff standoff between Washington and Beijing, Chinese buyers walked away from American soybeans almost entirely. Data tracked by S&P Global showed Chinese purchasers avoided U.S. origin soybeans from April through late October of 2025, choosing instead to load up on cheaper supply from Brazil and Argentina. For Sarah, that meant grain bins stayed full, prices sagged, and every trip to the bank became a harder conversation. She was not alone. Across Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, farmers watched their biggest export market vanish overnight because of a fight that had almost nothing to do with soybeans and almost everything to do with power. In North Dakota, a farmer named Tyler Staffslian found himself building extra grain storage just to hold soybeans that had nowhere to go, watching silos fill up during what should have been a normal harvest season, while Chinese buyers loaded ships from Brazilian and Argentinian ports instead. That is the part people outside agriculture rarely think about. That a trade dispute fought in press conferences and social media posts translates, on the ground, into steel bins being welded together in a farmyard because the market that was supposed to absorb your harvest simply is not there anymore. China was not punishing farmers directly, of course. It was retaliating against tariffs, but the retaliation landed hardest on the exact communities that had the least to do with the policy decisions driving it. A pattern that has repeated itself throughout this entire trade war, where the people bearing the cost are rarely the people making the calls. Even Chinese officials have acknowledged the toll it took on the other side of the relationship, with a Chinese consul general in Chicago telling an industry conference that American farmers became a victim of the trade war and bore much of the cost of a fight that started somewhere else entirely. An unusually candid admission from a diplomat whose government was, at the same time, negotiating hard to limit exactly how many soybeans it would commit to buying going forward. The freeze finally cracked after President Trump and President Xi Jinping met in South Korea in late October 2025, then again in Beijing the following May. As part of that framework, Beijing agreed to purchase 12 million metric tons of soybeans before the end of the 2025 marketing year and committed to buying at least 25 million metric tons every single year through 2028, alongside a pledge to purchase at least $17 billion in additional American farm goods annually. Optimism returned to grain markets. Prices ticked up. But the recovery has been slow and uneven. USDA data showed soybean exports to China climbed 57% between January and March of 2026 compared to the year before, which sounds impressive until you realize China still accounted for less than 30% of total U.S. soybean exports during that stretch, well below the levels farmers were used to before the trade war began. By early August 2026, Chinese state buyers were finally picking up momentum again, purchasing roughly 238,000 metric tons in a single week, according to USDA figures, which analysts said put this year's buying only about a quarter of the way toward the annual 25 million ton target. Farm economists like Andrew Muhammad at the University of Tennessee and industry voices such as Stephen Maupin of the Tennessee Soybean Promotion Council have both said the same thing in different words. Relations are improving, but nobody in the Farm Belt believes things are fully back to where they were. And every farmer is still asking the same question out loud at the coffee shop. Will it actually get back to normal? That uncertainty is not accidental. It is a direct result of a much larger negotiation happening far above Sarah's fields, one being run by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer on one side, and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng on the other. On July 30th, 2026, Bessent and Greer held a call with He Lifeng specifically to press Beijing on outstanding commitments, both the agricultural purchases and a second, far more strategic issue, rare earth minerals. Bessent said afterward on social media that he had made it clear Washington expects China to fully honor its commitments on both fronts, and that the two sides also discussed standing up new institutions called the Trade Board and the Investment Board, mechanisms designed to manage the relationship going forward rather than lurch from crisis to crisis. Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirmed the two countries were moving toward implementing those boards. All of this is happening as the calendar counts down to September 24, 2026, when Xi Jinping is expected to arrive in Washington for a state visit the return leg of the diplomatic dance that began with Trump's trip to Beijing back in May. That May summit in Beijing produced what analysts have called constructive stability rather than a genuine breakthrough. There was no joint communique, there was no comprehensive trade agreement. What there was instead was an extension of a fragile truce, a temporary pause on some export controls, a handshake on soybeans, and an unspoken agreement that both countries would rather manage their rivalry than let it explode. Now shift the scene from Sarah's farmland to a battery plant somewhere in the industrial Midwest, where an engineer named David spends his days trying to scale up domestic battery production for electric vehicles and grid storage. His challenge has nothing to do with soybeans and everything to do with rocks pulled from the ground on the other side of the planet. Modern batteries, electric motors, wind turbines, fighter jets, smartphones, and MRI machines all depend on a group of materials most people could not name if their life depended on it. Elements like dysprosium, terbium, gadolinium, samarium, and lutetium, plus industrial materials like lithium, cobalt, and graphite. China does not just mine a large share of these materials. It dominates the refining and processing stage, the part of the supply chain that turns raw ore into something a factory can actually use. And according to the International Energy Agency's 2026 Global Critical Minerals Outlook, China controls the overwhelming majority of global processing capacity for lithium, cobalt, graphite, and rare earths. That dominance became a weapon in April 2025, when Beijing introduced sweeping export controls on 7 heavy rare earth elements, a move that forced some automakers around the world to slow production lines or halt them entirely because they simply could not get the magnets and materials they needed. Then, in October 2025, China escalated further, expanding the restrictions to cover products made anywhere in the world if they contained rare earths sourced from China or were produced using Chinese technology, an extraterritorial reach that alarmed governments from Washington to Brussels to Tokyo. The IEA estimated that if those expanded rules were fully enforced, they could put roughly $6.5 trillion a year of downstream production outside China at risk across the automotive, defense, energy, and high-tech sectors. That same October, Beijing also targeted the battery supply chain directly, announcing new controls on cathode materials, cathode precursors, graphite anode materials, and even the manufacturing equipment used to make lithium batteries, effective November 8, 2025. For David and thousands of engineers like him, this was not an abstract headline. It meant phone calls with suppliers who suddenly could not confirm delivery dates. It meant procurement teams scrambling to qualify new vendors in Australia, Canada, and South America. It meant project timelines slipping by months while executives searched for alternatives. David's own team spent weeks mapping out exactly how many of their components traced back to Chinese processing at some stage, even components purchased from suppliers in Germany or South Korea, because those suppliers were themselves often buying refined rare earth oxides or battery-grade materials that had passed through Chinese facilities before ever reaching a factory floor. That kind of hidden dependency is exactly what worried policymakers most about the October 2025 rules, since a restriction on Chinese origin materials could theoretically reach into products assembled almost anywhere in the world, turning a Chinese trade decision into a global manufacturing decision overnight. Heavy rare earth elements like dysprosium and terbium turned out to be the tightest choke point of all, since China's production quota for those elements has stayed essentially flat since 2014, even as demand for the high-performance magnets that rely on them has climbed steadily, and the supply growth for heavy rare earths has lagged years behind the growth in lighter, more common rare earth elements. Alternative sources exist, but come with their own complications. Myanmar supplies a significant share of the world's heavy rare earth feedstock, but remains gripped by civil conflict that makes long-term supply contracts risky, while newer projects in Brazil built around ionic clay deposits are seen as promising, but still years away from meaningful scale. For a company like David's, that meant treating rare earth sourcing less like a routine purchasing decision and more like a national security exercise, complete with dual sourcing requirements, buffer inventory, and executives who now read Chinese Ministry of Commerce announcements the way they used to read quarterly earnings reports. The expanded October measures were eventually suspended for 1 year until November 2026 as a confidence-building gesture tied to the broader Trump-C framework, but virtually every trade lawyer and supply chain analyst who has studied the situation agrees on one point: the pause is temporary and the underlying leverage has not gone away. As one leading researcher on Chinese industrial policy put it, licensing requirements themselves are not something Beijing views as negotiable. They are a permanent feature of how China intends to manage its critical mineral position going forward. And the pressure has not stopped at rare earths. In May 2026, China moved to restrict exports of sulfur, a critical feedstock for the sulfuric acid used to process copper, lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earths. sending acid prices spiking and, in some cases, making sulfuric acid costs the single largest input expense in mineral processing, even ahead of energy. The cumulative effect of all this uncertainty showed up in the investment numbers, too. Global critical mineral investment actually fell 9% in 2025, the first decline in years, as investors grew cautious, watching Beijing tighten and loosen its grip in ways that were nearly impossible to predict. Graphite tells a similar story on its own. China currently controls somewhere between 90 and 95% of the world's battery-grade graphite supply, and industry analysts warn that without new sources coming online, global demand could outstrip supply by roughly 2.5 million tons by 2035, a gap large enough to slow the entire pace of vehicle electrification worldwide. So what is Washington actually doing about all of this instead of just complaining about it? Quite a lot, as it turns out. In February 2026, President Trump announced Project Vault, formerly called the U.S. Strategic Critical Minerals Reserve, a $12 billion initiative combining a $10 billion direct loan from the Export-Import Bank with roughly $2 billion in private capital, designed to stockpile rare earths, lithium, cobalt, and nickel, so that American manufacturers are not caught flat-footed the next time Beijing tightens the valve. The reserve covers all 60 minerals on the U.S. Geological Survey's critical minerals list, with early priority given to rare earth elements, and it is structured so that purchase commitments from major manufacturers like Clarios, GE Vernova, Western Digital, and Boeing help determine what actually gets stockpiled. Around the same time, the administration hosted the 2026 Critical Minerals Ministerial, bringing together 54 countries to launch a new alliance called FORGE, the Forum on Resource Geostrategic Engagement, replacing the older Mineral Security Partnership and aiming to build a coordinated, allied trade and investment zone that can compete with China's grip on the market. 11 new bilateral critical mineral agreements were signed with countries including Argentina, Morocco, the Philippines, the United Arab Emirates, and the United Kingdom. In total, the U.S. government says it has mobilized more than $30 billion in loans, letters of interest, and direct investment for critical mineral projects over roughly the past 6 months alone. Some of that money has already landed in very specific places. The Department of War invested $400 million into MP Materials, the company that operates Mountain Pass, the only active rare earth mine in the entire United States, producing roughly 15% of the world's rare earth concentrate. Washington also took equity-style stakes in USA Rare Earth, the Canadian miners Lithium Americas and Trilogy Metals, and a North Carolina-based magnet manufacturer called Vulcan Elements. Smaller but meaningful grants went to companies like Amero Advanced Materials in Tennessee, Empire State Mines in New York, and Hyperion X in Virginia, all part of an effort to rebuild processing capacity on American soil piece by piece. Wall Street noticed immediately. When Project Vault was announced, MP Materials stock jumped as much as 7% in a single trading session, and shares of smaller rare earth developers like USA Rare Earth spiked even higher before settling back down. A clear sign that investors now treat American critical minerals policy as a market-moving event on par with a Federal Reserve decision. Not everyone thinks the stockpile alone will be enough. Industry veterans like Almonte Industries CEO Louis Black have pointed out that $12 billion, while historic, is still a modest number once spread across dozens of different metals compared to the scale of Cold War-era stockpiling, and that rules requiring the government to buy without disrupting existing markets limit how aggressively the reserve can actually move. Commodities analysts covering the space, including Helen Amos at BMO Capital Markets, have described the American approach as an all-of-the-above strategy, taking direct equity stakes, building physical stockpiles, and signing strategic partnership agreements simultaneously rather than betting everything on a single tool, precisely because officials in Washington know they are trying to unwind decades of Chinese head start in a matter of a few years. One analyst tracking the broader picture even suggested that behind the scenes policymakers have quietly discussed something resembling a sovereign investment vehicle, a public capital pool that could co-invest alongside private companies in mining and processing projects far beyond America's own borders, which would represent a genuinely new role for the U.S. government in a sector it mostly left to private markets for the past half-century. Whether that idea ever becomes official policy or not, the direction of travel is unmistakable. Taxpayers now effectively hold equity or equity-linked positions in a growing list of critical mineral companies, from MP Materials to Trilogy Metals to Lithium Americas, a level of direct government involvement in a single industrial sector that has not been seen in the United States since the post-war decades. Meanwhile, a second front in the diversification effort is quietly building momentum inside the recycling industry. Battery recycling, once treated as a niched environmental afterthought, has become a genuine strategic asset. The global lithium-ion battery recycling market is projected to grow from roughly $6.9 billion in 2026 to somewhere between $31 and $37 billion by 2035, depending on the forecast you trust, driven by a wave of first-generation electric vehicle batteries reaching the end of their life at the same time. Automakers are desperate to reduce their exposure to Chinese supply chains. Companies like Redwood Materials, Li-Cycle, Umicore, and American Battery Technology Company are scaling up hydrometallurgical recovery processes that can now reclaim up to 95% of the lithium and cobalt and 97% of the nickel inside a dead battery pack. Automakers including BMW, Volkswagen, and Stellantis have already signed binding offtake agreements locking in recycled material purchases through 2032. Graphite recycling is following the same path, with companies like Orbia building new infrastructure specifically because, as the industry itself now openly admits, traditional mined and synthetic graphite simply cannot scale fast enough or safely enough to meet demand on its own. The chemistry of the batteries themselves is shifting too, which adds another layer of complexity for David and his procurement team. A growing share of new electric vehicles now use lithium iron phosphate cells instead of the older nickel manganese cobalt formula, partly because LFP is cheaper and partly because it sidesteps some of the cobalt sourcing headaches tied to artisanal mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But LFP production and its precursor materials remain even more heavily concentrated in China than the older chemistry was, which means the shift toward supposedly safer batteries has, in some respects, deepened rather than reduced American exposure. Sodium-ion batteries are being pitched by some manufacturers as a longer-term escape hatch since sodium is abundant almost everywhere and does not require lithium or cobalt at all, though the technology is still years away from matching lithium-ion energy density at scale. The United States is not the only government racing to build alternatives either. The European Union has designated 60 separate projects as strategic under its Critical Raw Materials Act, spread across 13 member states, with formal targets of sourcing 10% of critical minerals from domestic extraction, processing 40% domestically, and recycling 25% of critical minerals back into the supply chain by 2030, covering lithium, nickel, graphite, cobalt, and rare earths. European officials have acknowledged that more than 80% of firms on the continent working in defense and energy still depend heavily on Chinese supply chains, and that approval rates for European companies seeking Chinese export licenses fell below 25% in 2026. Numbers that have pushed Brussels to move with a genuine sense of urgency rather than the slower, more deliberate pace European industrial policy is usually known for. Mexico and the broader Pacific Alliance bloc of Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Costa Rica have started making similar moves, positioning themselves as a nearshoring alternative for critical mineral processing tied to North American battery and semiconductor supply chains, even though Mexican law currently restricts rare earth exploration to state-controlled entities, which slows how quickly private capital can actually get projects moving. None of this changes the reality that David and engineers like him are living through right now. Months of qualifying new suppliers, redesigning components around materials that are actually available, and building in extra cushion on every timeline because nobody wants to bet a production line on a political relationship that can shift with one social media post. Which brings the story back to the calendar and to September 24th, 2026, the date President Trump confirmed from the White House Rose Garden that Xi Jinping will arrive in Washington for his state visit, the culmination of 8 months of shuttle diplomacy that, according to several economic analysts, has already cut the U.S. goods deficit with China by more than 30%. But almost everyone studying the relationship closely describes what is happening the same way, a framework for bargaining rather than a genuine settlement. Underneath the trade talk, there are harder issues simmering, tension around Taiwan, a standoff near Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea, and a broader contest for influence across Asia that no soybean purchase or rare earth license can paper over completely. Trade itself has not been decoupling so much as diverting, with U.S. trade deficits ballooning with countries like Vietnam and Taiwan as manufacturing quietly reroutes through third countries rather than disappearing from Chinese factories altogether. And through all of it, ordinary Americans are footing part of the bill whether they realize it or not. Current tariff rates on Chinese goods now run in a complicated stacked structure, with a baseline of roughly 25% under Section 301 authority on most products, climbing to 50% on semiconductors, 60% on solar panels and steel and aluminum, and as high as 100 to 110% on Chinese-made electric vehicles. Economic researchers at Yale's Budget Lab estimate the broader tariff regime has pushed electronics prices up by roughly 10% and new vehicle prices up by more than 6%. Translating into an average consumer loss somewhere between $1,100 and $2,000 per household, once you account for how families adjust their spending habits. Independent tax analysts have put the average household tariff burden at around $1,000 in 2025, moderating to roughly $700 in 2026 as some measures expire, though new ones keep getting layered on almost as fast as old ones sunset. The legal picture underneath all of this got messier in February 2026, when the Supreme Court struck down the broad emergency tariff authority the administration had been using under IEEPA, the law originally meant for genuine national emergencies, not everyday trade disputes. That ruling forced Washington to lean harder on other legal tools that survived the challenge, particularly Section 301, the same statute used during the first Trump administration, and a new flat Section 122 surcharge that stacks on top of everything else. The result is a tariff code so layered that importers now describe it as a puzzle rather than a schedule, where a single product can carry a base most favored nation rate, a Section 301 duty, a Section 232 national security duty, and a general surcharge all at once, sometimes pushing the combined rate on a single item well past 75%. For consumer electronics and machinery, the effective floor has settled somewhere around 35%. For semiconductors, it runs closer to 50%. China, for its part, has not simply absorbed these measures quietly. Beijing's retaliatory tariffs on American goods spiked as high as 84% during the worst of the April and May 2025 escalation, before easing to roughly 10% under the November truce. And Chinese regulators have leaned on tools beyond tariffs entirely, adding American firms in defense, semiconductors, and dual-use technology sectors to an unreliable entity list, and placing extra duties on American sorghum and targeted agricultural products, even as soybean purchases were being negotiated separately. Aviation has become its own quiet battlefield inside the larger trade war, too, with Chinese purchases of Boeing aircraft treated by both governments as a politically symbolic bargaining chip almost as sensitive as soybeans, since a single wide-body order can be worth billions of dollars and thousands of American manufacturing jobs in Washington state and beyond. Car buyers are feeling it in very concrete ways, with Section 232 tariffs alone adding somewhere between $1,500 and $5,000 to the sticker price of many non-North American built vehicles, and considerably more for European luxury brands. So here is where all three threads finally meet. Sarah watching her export numbers inch back toward normal, but still nowhere near where they used to be. David rebuilding his supply chain one qualified vendor at a time, while a one-year suspension on export controls ticks toward its November 2026 expiration. And a family somewhere in America quietly paying a little more every time they buy a laptop, a car, or a set of solar panels, without ever connecting those extra dollars to a phone call between Bessent and Helifang or a mine in California called Mountain Pass. This is not really a story about soybeans or lithium at all. It is a story about leverage, about which side is willing to absorb more pain before the other one blinks. The United States holds enormous consumer demand, deep capital markets, advanced technology, and some of the most productive farmland on the planet. China holds manufacturing scale most of the world cannot match, and a multi-decade head start in processing the materials that power almost everything electric. Neither side can walk away from the other cleanly, not without inflicting real damage on itself in the process. And both governments know it, which is exactly why the relationship keeps oscillating between confrontation and cautious cooperation instead of settling into either one permanently. As September 24th approaches, expectations in Washington and Beijing are by nearly every account deliberately modest. Another extension, another partial commitment, another set of boards and mechanisms designed to manage friction rather than eliminate it. The bigger question, the one that will matter long after this particular summit fades from the news cycle, is how much economic dependence each country is ultimately willing to tolerate, and how much money, time, and political capital each side is willing to spend building alternatives so that dependence shrinks a little more with every passing year. Farmers like Sarah want customers they can count on planting season after planting season. Engineers like David want suppliers who will not vanish overnight because of a policy dispute they have no control over. Investors want predictability instead of headlines that move rare earth stocks 10% in a single afternoon. And regular people, the ones buying groceries, financing a car, or checking a retirement account quietly invested in mining companies and battery makers they have never heard of, mostly just want prices to stop climbing for reasons nobody bothers to explain to them. What began as a fight over tariffs and a trade deficit has clearly evolved into something much larger, a slow-motion contest over who controls the physical building blocks of the modern economy, the soybeans that feed the world, the magnets that spin electric motors, and the minerals buried in rock formations from California to Mongolia. It is worth remembering how quickly this entire relationship can still swing in either direction. A single social media post from the president in late October 2025, threatening a full 100% tariff on all Chinese imports, briefly sent global stock markets sliding, before a softer follow-up message calmed things down within 48 hours. A reminder that this is a negotiation still being conducted partly in public, in real time, with genuine consequences for anyone holding stock in a mining company or trying to plan a factory build out 18 months in advance. That volatility is precisely why every serious player in this story, from USDA officials to Pentagon procurement teams to battery executives, keeps repeating some version of the same message: diversify, stockpile, recycle, and never again let a single country hold that much leverage over materials this essential. The countries and companies that figure out how to diversify fastest without blowing up the relationship entirely are the ones most likely to come out ahead when the next crisis inevitably arrives. For Sarah, that might mean finally seeing her grain bins empty out on schedule every autumn instead of sitting full through another uncertain winter. For David, it might mean a supply chain resilient enough that a single ministry decision in Beijing no longer has the power to freeze an entire product launch. For the family down the street, it might simply mean a car payment, a phone upgrade, or a grocery bill that stops climbing for reasons buried in trade documents nobody outside Washington ever reads. And for the two governments steering this relationship, the test arriving on September 24th, 2026, is not really about whether they can sign a perfect deal. It is about whether they can keep proving, meeting after meeting, board after board, that managing this rivalry is still cheaper than letting it break. Because if history over the past 2 years is any guide, the answer will not take long to find out. And the next chapter of this story is already being written in soybean fields, battery plants, and mineral warehouses across the country right now.